Hello, my friends! It's time for part 3. Make sure you watch the previous parts if you haven't, otherwise, not a lot of things will make sense. So, now that we've talked about World War One, it's time to move on to the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. The goal here was the creation of a lasting peace, one that would positively affect everyone in the world. Did it achieve that, or did it fail? Well, let's see. Now, during the treaty, there were three main players: Woodrow Wilson, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. They all agreed that the war was solely Germany's fault, but they had different ideas about how to deal with them. Now, Clemenceau was kind of a jerk. He wanted to cripple Germany so that they wouldn't invade France in the future. I wonder how that one turned out. David Lloyd George was a bit of a moderate. He wanted to punish Germany, but not as badly as Clemenceau. As for Wilson, he opposed punitive measures on Germany and let the 14 points dictate his intentions. Wilson's main goal during the negotiations was the establishment of the League of Nations. In fact, he focused on it way too much that he really couldn't achieve any of his other goals. Should we punish Germany? Well, as long as Wilson gets his League of Nations thing, it's okay. How should we divide the former Ottoman territories? Well, the Europeans can split it between each other in any way they want, even though that can create a lot of problems, as long as Wilson gets his League of Nations thing. Now, it's important to note that the promises made in the 14 points gave a lot of hope to colonized nations around the world, as they hoped to finally get the right to self-determination. Wilson's idea, however, turned out to be very different from theirs, as he came up with the mandate system for territories formerly held by the Central Powers. The results? They ended up being terrible. Let's let aside the racism deeply rooted within the idea. It led to a lot of ethnic tensions in almost everywhere it was implemented. Tensions that even led to genocides later on. Now, during all of this, many activists from around the world, including ones from America, were warning Wilson about the new partition of the world and how it goes against his own Wilsonian ideals of self-determination. He responded by actively avoiding all of these people. Now, my theory as to why he would do that is, he didn't truly believe in his own ideals strongly enough to back them at the negotiating table. And I'm not just saying that, I actually have proof. So Japan at one point during the negotiations put forth a racial equality proposal, which basically meant that every member of the League of Nations would support racial equality as a principle that needs to be respected. A majority of the countries actually voted for it, but Wilson, being a segregationist, flat out refused to include this proposal and just personally overturned it after giving a BS excuse. Now, he could have done this when the issue was the partition of the Middle East or Germany's punishment, but as you may have realized by now, Wilson believed in racism more than his own Wilsonian ideals of spreading democracy. Nonetheless, the negotiations ended, and Wilson actually believed them to be a huge success, as he proclaimed, "At last, the world knows America as the savior of the world." So, was the peace treaty a huge success? Was the Great War worth it? The short answer is no. The treaty didn't achieve a lot, if I'm honest, and the most significant thing it was able to do was provide the right conditions to start a Second World War only 20 years later. Anyway, Wilson now had to go back to America and get the Senate to ratify the treaty. He needed a two-thirds majority, which meant he needed significant support from Republicans, who at that point had control of the Senate. But there was a problem. Wilson made a huge mistake. He didn't let any Republican senators participate in the treaty negotiations, which would make the whole thing look like a partisan effort. Republicans, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, blocked ratification. They basically wanted to negotiate a bit more, as they thought some things in the treaty needed to change. Wilson, however, refused to negotiate with the Senate, and that meant he couldn't get enough support for the ratification. The United States ended up never ratifying the Versailles Treaty, and they also never joined the League of Nations, something that must have been very embarrassing for Wilson. Now, while America's president was preoccupied with the Versailles Treaty, a lot of things were happening inside his country. It was 1919, probably the craziest year in American history. And yes, it's crazier than 2020. Now, with the rise of the Soviet Union, Americans started to get scared that their country may devolve into madness in the same way that Russia did. And with the Espionage and Sedition Act still in effect, the Bureau of Investigations, the Military Intelligence Division, and the American Protective League all collaborated to keep domestic spying going, despite their wartime function having already ended. They now focused on Bolshevism, which they saw as a threat that existed within the country. At that same time, there were labor strikes raging all across America, with workers demanding higher pay. These strikes were seen as attempted communist revolutions, and the government clamped down on them, sometimes violently. Domestic spying hit an all time high in 1919, and raids were being carried out by the BOI left, right, and center. A second problem was happening in that year, and it was lynching. Now, lynchings are actually a big part of American culture, and they were very popular ever since the country's founding. However, by the early 20th century, they started to take more of a racial undertone, and in 1919, things became way worse. Black people were being lynched constantly, and it became almost like an epidemic, spreading all around the country. This increase in lynchings led to a huge number of race riots, collectively known as the Red Summer. And in some cases, these riots resembled actual battles. At that same time, civil rights movements were being connected with communism and anarchism, even though such a connection never existed. And thus, they were also targeted by the three organizations we talked about earlier. Hell, even the MIT had a division dedicated to Negro subversion, whatever that means. And by the way, all of this was happening while there was a worldwide Spanish flu pandemic which killed millions of people. So, what did Wilson do about all of this? Well, nothing. He had little to say about the violence, especially the race riots, as he was too busy being in Paris for the Versailles Treaty. And it's not like people weren't warning him about what was going on, they were. He just kept avoiding them, all like, oh yeah, they're killing black people. I guess that's fine. What are you complaining about? Some other things that happened in 1919 include the ratification of two important constitutional amendments, the 18th and 19th. It was some momentous historic stuff and really just part of the craziness of that year. The 18th Amendment was, of course, the Prohibition one. Now, the movement for the prohibition of alcohol had been gaining huge popularity in America ever since the mid 19th century, and it got a huge boost when, during World War I, Wilson instituted a temporary wartime prohibition in order to save grain for the war effort. This would eventually lead to the constitutional amendment passing, and also the subsequent Volstead Act, which banned the sale, manufacture, and transport of any beverage containing at least 0.5% alcohol per volume. To be fair to Wilson, he did actually veto this act, but his veto was overridden by Congress. So, yeah, that's how 13 years of prohibition started. Now let's move on to the 19th Amendment, a good one for a change. This one was done to allow women the right to vote. At first, as you guys may know from part 1, Wilson was very much opposed to women's suffrage. But once women started protesting in front of the White House, literally chaining themselves to the White House fencing, he relented and actually began reluctantly supporting the suffrage movement. But he had his own weird Wilson reasons for changing his mind. He basically said, well, women helped us during the war, so the least we can do is give them the vote or something. The amendment was proposed in 1919 and came into effect in 1920, making the election of that year the first one when women voted in America. As if this year couldn't get any crazier, when Wilson came back to America after the Paris Conventions had ended, he became very ill a few months later and he had a severe stroke. So severe that the president was bedridden for months and paralyzed from his left side. This illness was kept from the public, and no one really knew what his true condition was until way later on, though many speculated. He basically became like the king in chess, so he needed a queen to do his job for him. That queen was his wife, Edith Wilson, who, when she saw her ill husband, she was like,
Aw, how unfortunate. Maybe I could do your job for you.
She kept doing that so much that she effectively took over the entire executive branch.
You know what? Screw it. I'm the president now.
It's important to note, however, that there's a lot of debate as to the extent of her influence in terms of policy. But I'd like to think she was pretty influential, since that's the more fun reality I want to live in. So if you wanted a female president, well, you maybe, possibly, probably already got one. After Wilson recovered in 1920, he basically did nothing during the rest of his second term. Well, other than the fact that he tried to run for a third term, I mean, Democrats didn't let him do so because, he was barely alive by now and really couldn't handle 4 more years. Nonetheless, his name was put in the Democratic National Convention, but he didn't get the nomination. And that's why I don't have to do a part 4, which, is such a good thing for my mental health. Wilson stayed alive for a couple more years and died of a stroke in 1924. Wilson is gone, but his influence has persisted throughout the years. So much so that it will be hard for me not to mention him in my future videos about presidents. So, what has he left us with? Well, racism and Jim Crow at the federal level, a distorted version of progressivism that suspiciously looked like tyranny, and made the whole country switch to conservatism just from fear of Wilson's policies coming back. His foreign policy was extremely interventionist, case in point, invading Mexico twice. Wilson also failed terribly at following through on the promises of the 14 points, not only by explicitly violating some, but also by allowing the end of World War I to be about consolidation of power rather than about spreading democracy. And to top it all off, when his country was embroiled in racial-fueled violence, he did nothing. What a great legacy he has left us with. And with that, I guess we could say, with much confidence, that Woodrow Wilson is the worst president in American history.
Wilson, that's all. Wilson, that's all. Who strikes